I wasn't looking for a cover-up when I started pulling on this thread. I was looking for a land deed. My great-great-grandmother, a woman named Elsa, listed in no census I could find before 1871, appeared fully formed in the historical record in a small Illinois township called Bureau County. No birth record, no immigration papers, no previous address, just a name, a plot of land, and a notation in a communal ledger that said, simply, arrived from the settlement. What settlement? Nobody wrote it down. I spent 3 years trying to answer that question, and what I found wasn't a missing ancestor. It was something far larger, a pattern so consistent, so deliberate, so perfectly timed that once you see it, the official story of 19th century America doesn't just look incomplete, it looks engineered. Here is what I found. Between 1845 and 1920, something extraordinary happened on the American continent. Hundreds of communities appeared, not gradually, not organically the way towns grow, but suddenly, almost overnight. They were called utopian settlements, experimental communities, socialist communes, religious retreats. The history books give them half a paragraph and move on. Failed idealism, quaint curiosities, nothing to see here. But the more closely you look, the more that explanation dissolves. Because these communities shared something the official history never adequately explains. They appeared in coordinated waves. They clustered in specific geographic regions. They harbored members whose origins were deliberately unrecorded. They built structures that should have been architecturally impossible given their resources. They developed, and then carefully extinguished, languages that no linguist has ever been able to classify. And then, between 1895 and 1920, almost all of them dissolved simultaneously, leaving almost no first-hand accounts, almost no exit testimony, almost no record of why they ended. The official explanation is that these communities failed. But failed communities leave wreckage. They leave arguments, debts, bitter memoirs, court cases, newspaper coverage of collapse. These communities left almost nothing. They just closed, quietly, as if their purpose had been fulfilled. The question I couldn't stop asking was, what purpose? And the answer kept pointing to the same place. To a civilization history says never existed. To a name that keeps appearing in the margins of maps and documents that powerful institutions have spent considerable effort explaining away. Tartaria. Let me show you the geography first, because this is where the argument becomes difficult to dismiss. Tartaria researchers, and I use that term without apology because the evidence demands serious engagement, have spent years cataloging what they call architectural anomalies. Buildings that appear in mid-19th century American cities with no documented construction period. Structures of extraordinary sophistication appearing in frontier settlements that, by any measure, lack the workforce, the supply chains, and the accumulated craft knowledge to produce them. The Tennessee state capitol, completed in 1859 in a city that had fewer than 15,000 people. Columns of such precision, proportion, and decorative complexity that the construction would challenge a modern firm with modern equipment. The contractors of record were small local operations. The master craftsmen left no other documented works. The Centennial Exhibition Buildings in Philadelphia, 1876. 250 acres of exhibition halls, some assembled in under a year, demonstrating structural techniques, acoustic engineering, and thermal regulation that didn't appear in American architectural manuals until the 1890s. After the exhibition, most of these buildings were demolished with almost unseemly haste. The records of who built them are fragmented and incomplete. Hotel buildings of Saratoga Springs, New York, Colorado Springs, Colorado, Eureka, California. Grand, elaborate, structurally complex buildings appearing in these towns in the 1860s and 1870s when those towns were, by contemporary accounts, barely settled. Hotels with hundreds of rooms, with ornate facades, with heating and ventilation systems of startling sophistication. Built by whom? The records say local contractors. The buildings themselves say something else. Now here is where it gets interesting. Map the geographic clusters of Tartarian architectural anomalies. Upstate New York, the Ohio River Valley, the Illinois Prairie Corridor, the California Coastal Range, the Pacific Northwest river systems. Then map the locations of America's utopian communities from 1840 to 1900. The overlap isn't perfect, but it is not random either. Within a 50-mile radius of the major concentrations of anomalous architecture, you will find in almost every case at least one significant utopian settlement, often more, as if the communities and the buildings belonged to the same geography, as if they were part of the same network. As if whoever placed the buildings also placed the communities nearby. Now let me tell you about the silence around origins. One of the most consistent features of America's utopian settlements across denomination, across geography, across decade, is the deliberate absence of member origin records. This is not a minor archival gap. It is a structural feature of how these communities kept records. The Harmony Society, founded by Johann Georg Rapp in western Pennsylvania in 1804, relocated to Indiana in 1814, then back to Pennsylvania in 1824, and maintained operations until 1905. Over that century, they kept extraordinarily detailed records: agricultural yields, manufacturing output, financial ledgers accurate to the penny, the names, ages, and skills of every member. But prior addresses, prior family histories, the communities from which members came before joining, almost entirely absent. Historians explain this as a feature of the community's theology. Members were leaving the old world behind. Their past was irrelevant. Only their future in the community mattered. That explanation might satisfy if it applied to one community, but it applies to virtually all of them. The Oneida community in upstate New York kept records of astonishing granularity. They documented communal property down to the individual tool. They tracked marriages, children, disputes, resolutions. Their leader, John Humphrey Noyes, believed in radical transparency and meticulous documentation. But the prior lives of members, where they came from, who their families were, what they had done before arriving at Oneida, this information is systematically absent from the official records. The Amana colonies in Iowa, founded by German-speaking immigrants in 1855, maintained 7 villages and over a century of continuous operation. Their archives are extensive. But ask the archives where the founding members came from before emigrating, not just their country but their specific regions, their villages, their previous community affiliations, and the documentation becomes surprisingly sparse. The Bishop Hill colony in Illinois, the Bethel colony in Missouri, the Aurora colony in Oregon, the same pattern: exquisite records of internal life, near total silence about who members were before they arrived. This isn't what communities do when they're simply starting fresh. This is what communities do when origin information is dangerous, when knowing where someone came from, or being known, poses a risk. The question is, a risk to whom, and from what? Here is the timeline you need to hold in your mind. According to the Tartaria hypothesis, and let me be precise about this, because the hypothesis has many versions and I want to be careful, a civilization of significant sophistication occupied large portions of North America and Eurasia into the early 19th century. The remnants of this civilization are visible in the anomalous architecture that pepper the historical record. The civilization was not destroyed by war or plague, but absorbed, overwritten, its history systematically reattributed or erased by the powers that superseded it. The proposed timeline for this erasure centers on roughly 1800 to 1860, the critical decades when, according to this framework, the last living remnants of Tartarian civilization, the people who remembered it from the inside, who spoke its languages, who possessed its technical knowledge, were still alive but dying off. The first major wave of American utopian communities began in 1840. That is not a coincidence that can be comfortably set aside. If you needed to manage the final generation of a suppressed civilization, to isolate them, to allow them to live out their remaining years under controlled conditions, to ensure that their knowledge did not propagate into the wider culture, to create environments where their languages could be spoken privately but not taught to children, where their technical skills could be practiced but not documented, a network of semi-isolated communal settlements would be an extraordinarily effective mechanism. Not prisons, gilded enclosures, places where the last survivors could live with dignity, in community with their own kind, practicing their own ways, while the outside world moved on and forgot they had ever existed. And then when the last of them died, when the oldest members, the actual witnesses, finally passed, the communities dissolved, their purpose fulfilled, their mission complete. Let me show you the linguistic evidence, because this is the part of the record that most consistently disturbs me. Visitors to 19th century utopian communities left accounts that deserve more attention than they have received. Not the promotional pamphlets, not the theological treatises, those were managed, curated, designed for public consumption. I mean the private journals, the newspaper dispatches, the letters sent home by journalists and curious visitors who saw things they couldn't fully explain. A journalist named Harlan Webb visited the Amana colonies in 1878 and wrote a lengthy dispatch that was published in a Cincinnati newspaper, and then, as far as I can determine, never reprinted or anthologized. Webb was not a sensationalist. His other dispatches from the period are sober, detailed, professional. But in his Amana piece, he writes about an experience during evening hours when he was waiting in a communal dining hall for his interview with a community elder. He heard from an adjoining room a conversation between what he described as several elderly voices. He wrote, and I am working from a photocopy of the original dispatch, that the language they were speaking was entirely unlike German, entirely unlike any Slavic tongue he had encountered, and possessed a quality he struggled to describe. He used the word architectural to describe its sound, as if the language itself had been constructed according to principles of proportion and structure. When the elder arrived and Webb mentioned what he had overheard, the elder smiled, said it was an old prayer language, a form of devotional speech used only in private meditation, and that visitors sometimes mistook it for ordinary conversation. He then directed Webb's attention to the interview topics. Webb noted that he never heard the language again during his 3-day visit, despite spending considerable time in communal spaces. This type of account appears with striking frequency across the visitor literature. An 1863 account from a Union Army officer visiting a Shaker community in Kentucky mentions hearing elderly members speaking in what he called a language of considerable antiquity that bore no resemblance to any tongue used by any people now living or lately known to history. He attributed it to glossolalia, religious speaking in tongues. But he noted that the speakers seemed to be having an ordinary conversation, not a religious ecstasy. They were discussing, as far as he could tell from their gestures and the objects they referenced, the repair of a roof beam. An 1891 account from a sociologist named Frederica Halm, visiting the remaining members of the Zor separatist community in Ohio, describes an elderly woman who would sometimes slip between languages mid-sentence, moving from German to something Halm could not identify and back again, as if both languages were equally native to her and the boundary between them was occasionally porous. When Halm asked about it, the woman appeared not to understand the question. Or appeared not to want to. The pattern is consistent: elderly members, a language that resists classification, practiced in private, hidden from outsiders, and never, as far as the historical record shows, systematically studied or recorded by anyone with the linguistic tools to analyze it. By the time scholars thought to ask, the speakers were gone. Now let me walk you through the construction knowledge, because this is where the impossibility becomes most stark. The Shakers built round barns. This sounds simple, it is not simple. A round barn, properly built, structurally sound, thermally efficient, with the acoustic properties that Shaker round barns consistently demonstrate, requires a sophisticated understanding of circular geometry, of load distribution in curved structures, of how materials behave under radial stress versus lateral stress. The engineering principles involved were not codified in American architectural and engineering literature until the 1880s and 1890s. The Shaker round barn at Hancock, Massachusetts, was completed in 1826. It is still standing. It has required no major structural repair. Its roof, a complex conical structure sitting atop a circular stone wall, distributes load so efficiently that it has outlasted dozens of conventionally constructed buildings built in the same era. The Shakers who built it were farmers, craftspeople, people who had joined a religious community. They were not trained architects, they were not engineers. They did not have access to the academic literature on structural engineering because that literature, for this type of construction, did not yet exist. The official explanation is that the Shakers were gifted intuitive builders, whose faith inspired creative problem-solving. That explanation requires you to believe that intuition produced, in one attempt, with no documented trial and error, a structural solution that professional engineers would not arrive at theoretically for another 60 years. I find that difficult to accept. The alternative, that the builders of the Hancock round barn possessed technical knowledge inherited from a tradition that predated the American Republic, a tradition with sophisticated understanding of structural engineering that mainstream American architecture had not yet rediscovered, this alternative is not comfortable, but it fits the evidence more cleanly. And it is not only the Shakers. The Harmonist buildings at Economy, Pennsylvania demonstrate masonry techniques that produce walls of extraordinary thermal stability. The interior temperature of the Harmonist Great House varies by less than 8 degrees Fahrenheit across the full range of Pennsylvania seasons. This is not insulation. This is thermal mass management, a precise understanding of how to orient walls, select materials, and proportion spaces to stabilize interior temperature. The principles are not mysterious. But they require knowledge. Who taught the Harmonists? Their leader, George Rapp, was a vintner and preacher from Württemberg. His followers were farmers and craftspeople. Their buildings should reflect that. the buildings do not reflect that. The Aurora colony in Oregon built a church in 1867, whose timber framing uses a joinery system that Oregon State University researchers examined in 1994 and described as consistent with Northern European master carpenter traditions dating to at least the 14th century. The colony's founders had emigrated from Missouri, before that, Germany. The specific regional tradition their joinery reflected was not from any documented German immigrant community. Where did that knowledge come from? The colonists couldn't say or didn't say. Here is the part of this story I find most haunting, and the part that most clearly suggests the communities were not accidental but designed. The rules around the elderly. In community after community, across denominations and geographies and decades, the oldest members, the true elders, the people who had arrived earliest and lived longest, occupied a special protected status that goes well beyond normal cultural respect for age. At the Amana colonies, the oldest members were formally designated in community records as *Sujin witnesses, not in a theological sense, not as a metaphor. Witness was their official community title, recorded in ledgers alongside their name and their assigned workshop or household. Witnesses to what? The community's own records never say. The Harmony Society maintained a structure they called the Elder Council that, by the community's own bylaws, could only be composed of members who had joined before a specific founding date. As those members died, the council shrank. It was never replenished with younger members. It was allowed to diminish slowly, until by 1900 it consisted of only 3 very elderly individuals. In 1905, those individuals approved the dissolution of the society. The last 3 witnesses voted to close the community. And then they died. Within 4 years of the dissolution vote, all 3 were dead. The community that had operated for over a century simply ceased to exist, its assets distributed, its buildings sold, its members dispersed into mainstream American life. The Oneida community maintained what their records called the First Circle, the original members, those who had been present from the beginning. As the community grew and evolved, the First Circle maintained special authority over certain decisions. Those decisions were never fully specified in the community's public documents. They were recorded only in a set of internal ledgers that, when the community dissolved in 1880, were reportedly burned. Why burn records? A community committed to documentation, to transparency, to the belief that truth serves progress. Why burn records when you dissolve? Unless the records contained something that could not be allowed to survive the community's dissolution. Unless the records documented something that the outside world was not supposed to know. Now I want to talk about the endings, because the endings are where the official history is most nakedly insufficient. Between 1895 and 1920, over 80% of America's major utopian communities dissolved. The official history calls this the natural end of the communitarian movement. Industrialization made communal economics less competitive. The progressive era redirected social, reform energy into political rather than communal channels. Leadership aged out. Second-generation members lacked the founders' conviction. These explanations are not wrong exactly, but they do not explain the timing with any precision. Because the communities that dissolved in this period were not, on the whole, struggling. The Harmony Society was wealthy. The Amana colonies were economically productive and socially stable. The Zor community had survived the Civil War, multiple leadership transitions, and the economic panics of the 1870s and 1880s without serious disruption. These were not failing experiments, reaching the end of their natural lifespan. These were thriving institutions that abruptly chose to stop. And the timing corresponds, with uncomfortable precision, to the death of the last generation. The people who had arrived in the community's earliest, the founders, the first members, the eldest Sujin, were dying in the 1890s and 1900s, not by violence, simply by age, the natural attrition of a generation reaching its 80s and 90s. And as they died, the communities dissolved. Not immediately after each death, not before, after, as if the communities existed to serve those members, and once the last of them was gone, there was no longer any reason to continue. This is not the pattern of failed idealism, this is the pattern of a completed mission. There is one more layer to this, and it is the layer I am most uncertain about, so I want to be careful about how I present it. Among Tartaria researchers, there is a persistent argument about what the civilization actually was. Some argue it was a global empire, politically unified, hierarchically organized. Others argue it was more like a cultural and technological sphere, connected communities sharing architectural traditions, engineering knowledge, and possibly a common language, without a single centralized authority. If the second interpretation is closer to the truth, then what was being preserved in the utopian communities was not the memory of an empire, but the living remnants of a knowledge tradition. A way of building, a set of metallurgical and textile techniques, a language or family of languages, a body of practical knowledge about the physical world that had developed over centuries outside the intellectual traditions that ultimately became dominant in European and American civilization. And this changes the nature of the communities. They were not prisons, they were not simply hiding places. They were arks. The Shaker Round Barn was not built to imprison anyone. It was built because someone among that community's founders knew how to build it correctly, and building it correctly was a way of demonstrating, to themselves if to no one else, that the knowledge still lived, that the tradition had not been entirely extinguished. The Amana textile mills produced cloth of extraordinary quality, not because the colonists were hiding a secret, but because they possessed, through inheritance and training, a technical tradition that mainstream American industry had not developed. They were not concealing it, they were practicing it, they were living it because it was what they knew. The languages heard in the evening hours, the flowing, architectural tongues that visitors could not identify and elderly members would not explain, were not spoken strategically. They were spoken the way any person speaks their first language when they are tired, or old, or simply among people they trust, because it was the language that came most naturally, because it was home. This interpretation makes the tragedy of the communities more acute, not less. Because it means that what was lost was not a secret, it was a living culture, a way of knowing and building and speaking and existing in the world, and it did not die because anyone successfully suppressed it. It died because the people who carried it in their bodies and their memories and their hands grew old and died, and the world they lived in did not create the conditions for it to be transmitted forward. Or was not allowed to. Consider what a systematic suppression of this knowledge transmission would actually require. You would not need violence, you would not need camps or guards, you would need only what these communities provided: separation from the wider culture, in communities where the old ways could be practiced privately but not taught openly, where children grew up surrounded by the tradition but not formally initiated into it, where the knowledge existed for one more generation and no more. You would need communities that felt like freedom but functioned like quarantine. You would need the old people to feel safe and cared for, to feel no urgency about transmission, to believe that what they knew would somehow persist on its own. You would need a system that produced what we might today call cultural burnout, a generation so exhausted by the work of survival that it did not have the energy to also become teachers. And then you would wait. The extraordinary uniformity of the silence, the fact that when these communities dissolved, their members returned to mainstream American life, and across thousands of individuals and dozens of communities in 3 decades, almost none of them wrote memoirs or gave interviews or spoke publicly about what they had known and practiced. This uniformity requires explanation. People do not simply choose silence en masse, not about transformative decades of communal living, not about languages and techniques and architectural knowledge, unlike anything in mainstream American culture, not spontaneously, independently, individually, across thousands of people who never coordinated with each other again after leaving. Unless they were afraid. Or unless they had been, slowly and quietly, helped to believe that what they knew was not worth passing on. I want to be precise about what I am claiming and what I am not. I am not claiming that I have proven Tartaria existed. The evidence for Tartaria is contested, and I am aware of the mainstream counterarguments. I am not dismissing those counterarguments. I am claiming that the pattern I have described, the timing, the geography, the deliberate silence around origins, the architectural impossibilities, the unclassified languages, the protected status of the eldest members, the coordinated dissolutions, the near-total absence of exit testimony, this pattern is real. It is documented. It is sitting in archives and newspaper morgues and local historical society collections across the country, waiting to be assembled. And the official explanation, idealistic reformers inspired by European socialist philosophy, who built communities that eventually failed under economic pressure and generational disillusionment, does not account for this pattern. It does not explain the coordination. It does not explain the silences. It does not explain why thriving communities dissolved when their eldest members died, or why the architectural knowledge those communities produced cannot be traced to any documented training tradition. The Tartaria framework, flawed and contested and incomplete as it is, actually accounts for these things. It provides a mechanism, not proof, a mechanism, a way of understanding why these communities existed, why they ended when they did, and what was lost when they closed. Here is the question I keep returning to. My ancestor Elsa, the woman with no documented history before 1871, the notation in the Bureau County Ledger, arrived from the settlement. What settlement? What did she know that the ledger did not name? What language did she speak in private, with people she trusted, before the last of her generation was gone? What did she see in her lifetime that no one thought to write down, or that someone decided should not be written? She had children, those children had children. I am here because of her. But whatever she carried, whatever she knew, whatever she had witnessed or inherited or practiced, that knowledge did not reach me. It stopped somewhere in the chain, in a generation that had been given every reason to be silent and no compelling reason to speak. The buildings are still there, the round barn at Hancock, the great house at Economy, the timber-framed churches of the Amana villages. They are still standing, demonstrating in their proportions and their engineering and their inexplicable durability that something was known here that mainstream history cannot account for. But the people who knew it are gone, and the communities built to contain them, whether as refuge or as quarantine, whether as arks or as cages gilded with religious purpose and communal warmth, have dissolved into the American countryside, leaving only these structures and a set of very careful silences. The official history says the Utopian experiment failed. But something about that framing has always bothered me. Experiments are designed to test a hypothesis. What was the hypothesis here? What were these communities actually testing? I started with a missing land deed and a woman with no past. I ended with a question that I do not think I am supposed to be asking. Were these communities built to preserve the last of something vast and ancient? Or were they built to make sure it quietly, gently, humanely disappeared? And who decided which of those it was? The buildings are still standing, but nobody left us the key to read them.